Well, it requires conversations, definitely, right? You need to have this matching in place. Who should talk to who, and in many cases also about what. And then you need a discipline around actually making sure that those conversations take place. Because as you know, I mean, just because we have one conversation, that is not building a connection, right? You need more than that.
Good morning, HR. I'm Mike Coffey, and this is the podcast where I talk to business leaders about bringing people together to create value for shareholders, customers, and the community. Please follow, rate, and review Good Morning HR wherever you get your podcast. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or at goodmorninghr.com. It is hard to believe it, but we're in the last quarter of 2023. This is the time when leaders begin reviewing their organization's performance in the past year and begin to think about the coming year. In some organizations, that may mean just minor course corrections in their strategy or execution, while in others, it may mean bold new initiatives. But in either circumstance, success or failure requires more than just a great vision or even just a great plan. It requires execution, and that means people. Joining me today to discuss change management and the surprising ways people and their relationships can make it or break it is Jeppe Vilstrup Hansgaard. Jeppe is the founder and CEO of Innovisor, a boutique advisory firm in change analytics and organizational network analysis. Jeppe has trained and worked with executives in more than 25 countries and is a frequent lecturer to executive MBA programs. Welcome to Good Morning HR, Jeppe.
Thank you. Good morning, Mike.
So you work in the area of change management, and anybody who's spent much time in either large or small organizations probably been through some sort of, culture change or strategy change that wasn't successful. And I think probably more often than not, they're unsuccessful, or at least they don't hit the targets that leadership really wants them to do. What do you think the main reason that we don't get what we want to out of our change initiatives?
Well, there's so many reasons, right? Maybe we're too ambitious, or maybe we just don't know the organizations where we want to conduct the change in. So one of the things that I have seen a lot is that we believe we can kind of impose change on our people, top down, but that's not really how people are making sense of change, right? It actually has to make sense to the people if you want to succeed. I think that's really the biggest disconnect. This is great research from Yoshida, and I think this is actually dating back to the 70s, where he talks about the iceberg of ignorance. And you are probably familiar with it, Mike. But it says something like that at the top, you know about 4% of the problems in the organization, and at the front line, you know 100%, right? And that is the disconnect that you have when you are working with change. You need really to listen to the front lines, to the people, to understand what is really going on and what is it that you need to care for when you conduct the changes.
Yeah, it's a lot like the Johari window, right? I know what I know, and I know what you know a certain thing, and I know what you know, but I don't know what you don't know, and there are things I don't know, and all of that. So, and leadership often, and I'm guilty of it, especially I think it's probably true with leaders who are entrepreneurial or visionary. We think people get it, right? And I in the past, before my team kind of put reins on me, I used to come back from conferences and I would be so excited and okay, here's what we're going to do, and this will make a giant change, and it would have, but if they didn't get what was in it for them, or how, not even necessarily them personally, but them in the execution of their job and how they were going to contribute to it, they weren't always on board with it the way I needed them to be, or didn't even get the concept. So when you're talking to leaders then about these different networks, and so it can't just be top down. So what's my alternative? If it's not just top down, how do we influence change in some other structure?
Yeah, no. So one of the things that I'm often looking at is that we talk about how do people make sense of this change that they are now facing, right? And it's really important. There's this formula I'm referring to, which I read in Atomic Habits, You're probably familiar with that book. Where
James Clear, it's great. Yeah.
exactly, it's the best book I've read this summer, actually. So the close beats the many, I'm normally saying, and the many beats the powerful when people are trying to make sense of things, right? And what does that mean? That means when I try to make sense of things, I get in contact with people I trust, that I sympathize with, and that I feel that I'm competent. And of course, people that I know, right? That is the close people, and that is a small group of people, really, right? And then when I've made sense with those people, I look around and see what is happening around me, right? Are people starting to adopt the changes that people want me to, right? And then if they do it, that's the many. And then the very last thing is actually the powerful, because I don't really like that people impose something on me, right? So I think when it really goes wrong with change, we do it the other way around. We start with the powerful, then we say we do mass communication to the many, and then maybe at the end we end with talking to individuals, right?
Right. And that's, I think that small group that just surrounds the people who actually need to execute the change and how they do their daily work. When they're not on, or they don't seem like they're on board, or they're not getting it. In
Yeah,
some organizations, they just get targeted uh, as obstacles, or old fashioned, or resistant to change. And what you're saying is it's probably the matter that leadership has got the cart before the horse, really.
yeah, yeah. I definitely think that if you can get those people on board, right, that's where the traction is for the change. One of the reasons why we always fail is that we forget about those people. Uh, the traction is in convincing those people out there in all the small groups and cliques and tribes, those people that people listen to. And it's like in the schoolyard in the old days, right? You know how it is, right? You had the cliques and the groups and tribes. If you wanted to organize a big party, you need to get into every single one of those groups really to convince people to join you, right? And it's the same thing.
So we can't just make the announcement, but especially in a larger organization, that can be challenging, though, right? How do I, are we talking, and if I've got, 500 people in my organization, does that mean 500 individual conversations, and who's going to make those? How do you have, get those folks on board, and not spend a year, just doing that?
Exactly, and see that's where the our analytics has been really helpful. So we found something which we discovered here actually over the years is if we can get to the right 3% of the people, they actually make sense to the 90% of the organization. It's something if you want to follow it, we call it the hashtag 3% rule, where we have cases and articles and videos and what have you. But the concept is really if we can find those 3%, they will do the work for you.
Hmm.
They are the sense makers. And it's, of course, in this case, how do you find them? It's a matter of asking people, who is it that you uh, go to for help and advice? Who is it that you find energizing, etc.? So you understand those relationships, right? Who is it that people seek out?
So we would call those in the social media world influencers.
Exactly.
People that people turn to and look to and trust. Uh, and so you said just ask people. Are most people self-aware enough to know how much influence other people have on them, or do you have to ask the questions in specific ways?
So to the people, if you ask the people, they don't know how much influence they have, which is the reason why you need to go to peer identification.
Okay.
In many cases, what we see is that those people that have the most influence, they have no clue that they have influence.
Okay.
I mean, I only got an anecdotal evidence of this on this, but often the introverts are actually some of the most influential people we see, which is kind of intuitive, right? Because if we think about it, we think, oh, it must be the loudspeakers, it must be those ones who are talking loud in the town hall meetings, etc., right? And it's not. Um, Far from it. We also think it's the high performers. It's not the high performers. It's the people that are just like you and me, right? We trust people that are like what we see when we look in the mirror.
So that's interesting. So, because I can see that playing out, and you're in Europe, but here, especially here in the U.S., I can definitely see in just our public and social dialogue around politics and social issues, a lot of people are realizing that the most vocal folks on either side of the issue don't represent the mass, that center of folks. And so you're saying it's the same in the organization. So if we're going to identify those in the organization, is that part of like a 360 process that we're doing, and we just slide that in there as a question in our 360 feedback process, or how do you really figure out who those 3% are?
Yeah, so you need to ask those questions, right? That's the first thing.
Mm-hmm.
You will never get
just
the
directly
answer.
ask, who do you trust? Is it like a question, who do you trust, or what? Kind
Yeah,
of give me
no.
an idea what that question
One of
is.
the questions I would ask is, who do you go to for help and advice? Another question that I really like is, who gives you energy in your daily work life? Because I mean, energy is magnetic, right? You will seek that out. If you give me energy, I will make sure that I am actually talking to you every day, right?
Okay.
So it's question like this that actually that determines traits of influence. You do not ask directly who influences you.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So you kind of need to go around it, and then you need to look at the networks, because if you have this, then now I know Jeppe is influencing Mike, or is looking to Mike. Then I can start to draw lines between people, and when you aggregate that, right, all of a sudden you have a network of people being connected to each other. Some people being close to each other, others being far away from each other and totally disconnected from each other. And as you can imagine, I mean, the biggest organization we've done this with was 200,000 people. That's an enormous network of people, right? Connected to each other in different ways. And that's where you need to have an algorithm actually to help you identify who should we actually engage in this. And if you just do it top down, or if you ask people to self-appoint to be a change ambassador, you're not getting there. I mean, who would self-appoint? Yeah, you know the answer, right?
Yeah, right. It's often the folks who, it's like politics. The people who want it, I would never want to vote for. Anybody who wants in that role is probably not the right person for it. So,
can I just say one thing?
yeah,
Because that reminds me of one of the. There's a fantastic quote from Abraham Lincoln that he actually said in, let me see, 1840 something, where he was trying to determine or tell what was his, how could he run a successful campaign, political campaign. And one of the things, one of his principles was that to persuade the undecided, send in someone they trust.
Okay.
And if you just hear that word, they trust, right? That's the important part. Because it's not we trust. It's not someone we trust that we should send in, right? You actually look at who is it that has the influence out there. And he already knew that I think it's 1841.
And it makes sense, and I guess it's not a new concept, except that it's not what we seem to be traditionally doing,
Yeah,
at least in the corporate entity. So we identify those folks, and this sounds like a use of algorithms or artificial intelligence that shouldn't get people too up in arms and with pitchforks out in the front yard. So we can, actually use, I'm assuming it's some sort of AI that says these are all the connections and here's your 3%. We identify those 3%. Then what do we do with them? I mean, is this where we get them all together, or how do we get them on board?
Yeah, and so I typically draw a 2x2, and how I'm very much aware that people can't see me, maybe if they're listening in the car, right? But the 2x2 goes like this. You got formal on one side to the left, and you got informal to the right, and then you got structured at the top, and you got unstructured at the bottom. So very similar. Let me just go through the 4 quadrants. So if you have at the top, you have top-down communication. You might have a function for this, right? It's your corporate communication, really. It's formal and it's structured. What do you have in the other quadrant? Right below, you got unstructured and formal. This is where the leaders, right now, they've communicated what they want you to achieve, right? Or do. This is where they move around in the organization, hopefully role modeling what you're trying to achieve, right? We do that already, right? This is what most organizations actually do with change. We do some leadership training. We're all good. When you know the 3%, you can actually add something in the informal sphere. So in the informal structured sphere, you can actually start to have engagement with the 3%. You can listen to them. You can try to understand what is going on in their world, right? So I normally say listen, listen, and listen, and then have a conversation. And when you have that conversation, you might find out they want to join you in your initiative and help you. They want to co-create activities with you. So it actually makes sense in their little group or tribe, right? And that is important because when you do that, they become insiders on the change. And that's really the trick. You want to get them to the point where they're insiders, but then they start to speak your case to the ones that actually trust them the most, which is everybody else. They're in the bottom right quadrant, which is informal and unstructured, right? They are all the people just trying to make sense of what is going on in the organization, and that big change that is suddenly coming, right? And it's not until it makes sense to those people that the change is actually happening. Change is never happening just because you communicate at top. It happens when it makes sense to the people.
And I imagine it would be easy for a corporate leader to identify, if once they get to the point where they've identified those 3%, to pull them together and say, here's what we're going to do, go sell it to the team. But what you're saying is they need to be involved in figuring it out, and understanding what the issues are, and maybe even having opportunity to give feedback into, okay, well, if this is the resolution you're going to suggest, here's what the impact would be on this group of people that I'm a part of, or that I'm ultimately influencing.
Exactly. That is the way. You need to make sure they're on board with it, right? And if they're not on board with it, then you'll have resistance building up, and that's where you get the pain.
So, COVID happened, and in 2024, I'm going to try and go 12 months without saying the word COVID in a single podcast, but we're not there yet. So, but we've gone remote or hybrid, and that's got to affect these informal communications and relationships. So have y'all done any work to look at what these different working environments have meant for that kind of relationship?
Too many to go through. but yes, so if you just go back to 2020, right? When we all were sent home, we were used to working in the office, many of us, right? What happened? But what really happened was that those big networks, right, they got disconnected from each other, except for the people that we were really close to. We stayed connected to our close friends.
Right.
Or our close relationships in the workshop, right? So what we can see is that, well, they basically the networks in the organizations got more disconnected from each other. They shrunk by, I think, 30% or something like that, which means that suddenly it became harder really to have those water cooler conversations with people you only saw maybe every 2 weeks or whatever, right? But the people we really trusted and we talked to, right? We stayed in contact with them. So those influencers, I should call them, right? The 3%, they stayed the same.
Interesting.
But here's the but. Of course, people also changed jobs, right? During the pandemic, you had what was it called? The quiet quitting and
the great resignation, right? All that. Yeah.
And then you ask, so what kind of impact did that have on the networks? And I can tell you that those people that joined a new company in that period right after the pandemic hit, so from about March 2020 and then until September 2020, in our numbers at least, we can see that they are significantly less integrated into the informal networks than the people that actually joined as from October 2020. And I think that was because we just didn't have the mechanisms in place to figure out how do we connect newcomers, right? We did it in the old ways. We didn't know how to do it. And I mean, to this day, we can still see that people that joined in that period from March 2020 to September 2020, they're still less integrated than the people that joined afterwards. And I think that's actually pretty interesting.
So that says a lot about the importance of onboarding and mentoring new employees in a team and things like that.
Yeah, we actually have been recommending to our clients that they actually get in touch with that group of people and make sure they're actually getting Yeah, we call it reboarding, right?
So what are you recommending then? So let's say we're a largely hybrid or fully remote even team, and we want to get somebody plugged into this informal network. What are your recommendations to your clients about how to do that?
Yeah, so if you understand the networks, you have several levels of the onboarding or the connecting of this, right? Of course, you need to understand what is the team that I should belong to. But what is more important actually for you to understand, okay, so who, when I face these critical problems, who are the go-to people that I need to get in touch with? And can I build that relationship to them so they actually feel it's okay to ask for help? These people are actually accessible to me. So one of the things we've seen, for example, in pharma companies, is that people are actually afraid to ask for help. And actually now I'm referring to some research we did in an R&D organization. They are innovating. It's new pharma products. What should those people do? They should definitely talk to each other, right? Uh, but in that research, we identified here that actually it's only about 30% that will actually ask a colleague for help if they face a complex problem. 30%. But if they got asked themselves if they would help if a colleague asked them, it was 70% that said they would definitely help their colleague if they got asked, right? So you got 30%, you got 70%. And what is that? That's an opportunity gap for me. I need to make sure that we can actually move the 30% that ask for help as far over here as possible.
And let's take a quick break. Good Morning HR is brought to you by Imperative, premium background checks with fast and friendly service. 24 years ago, I founded Imperative to help risk-averse companies make well-informed decisions about the people they involve in their business. And to be clear, we really are focused on employers for whom the acceptable margin of error in their hiring decisions is razor thin. That means we don't cut corners to lower cost. It means that although we have amazing technology, we don't substitute tech for situations where people will produce a better result. And it means that we're usually the most expensive option, but also the best value for an employer who's evaluating their employment screening process. To help in that evaluation, we've identified the most common ways background check companies cut corners that impact the quality, accuracy, and depth of the information they provide employers. You can review the 6 questions you should ask your background check partner at imperativeinfo.com/6. That's SIX. And of course, you can always reach out to Imperative to discuss your background check process through our website at imperativeinfo.com. If you're an HRCI or SHRM certified professional, this episode of Good Morning HR has been pre-approved for 1/2 hour of recertification credit. To obtain the recertification information, visit goodmorninghr.com and click on Recert Credits. Then select episode 116 and enter the keyword network. That's NETWORK. And if you're looking for even more recertification credit, check out the webinars page at imperativeinfo.com. And now back to my conversation with Jeppe Vilstrup Hansgaard. So, what do you attribute that to? What do you think it is that makes somebody unwilling to ask for help? Do you think it's a culture thing where I feel very competitive with my peers, or is it everybody that we're hiring has imposter syndrome and they don't want to show off, they don't want to show their perceived ignorance, or what do you think's going on there?
Yeah, the imposter syndrome is definitely there, right? So I normally say we don't want to show our incompetencies, right? That we actually have to ask for help, and that especially applies to a highly educated area like a research and development organization or in a law firm or whatever, right? The more education you have, the less likely you are to ask for help.
Interesting. And so, building in our onboarding process, then here's your resources. Here's on a day-to-day basis who you can always reach out to if you've got questions, and maybe even having, once you've identified that person, having them do something proactive to reach out to those people. How do you make sure that those relationships get formed?
Well, it requires conversations, definitely, right? You need to have this matching in place. Who should talk to who, and in many cases also about what. And then you need a discipline around actually making sure that those conversations take place. Because as you know, I mean, just because we have one conversation, that is not building a connection, right? You need more than that. Uh, we can see that actually it takes up to 5 conversations before people really are willing to actually open up and share stuff uh, with each other when they have that inside company. So 5 is a good number for me to remember.
Interesting. So those intentional conversations, would that be like just a one-to-one that we're going to schedule every week or something like that with this peer who's who's been identified, and we're just going to have those, where that peer takes the initiative to say, how's it going,
Yeah,
what's challenged you this week, those kind of things.
it's yeah. Well, so you can call it mentoring almost, right?
Okay, sure.
Or reverse mentoring in some cases, right? Because sometimes it's also good for the old people in the organization actually to listen to newcomers. So it goes both ways, I would say.
Okay.
Can I share with you maybe a really good example from this is from the US or from Boston, so a biotech company. And then in that company, we actually looked at, of course, we looked at the networks and the influence and all of that stuff, but we also looked at tenure in the company, so we could see who was it that connected to who, and then we added performance to it. And this is where the real surprise came to us. We could see that amongst the high performers, right? The high performers sought out the other high performers, so they had their own little network, right? Then you had the solid performers, they were called. The solid performers, they connected to solid performers, and to some extent also to the high performers because they aspired to be high performers, right? So what about the newcomers? Who do they connect to? Well, they did not or had not built the credibility in the organization yet. So the only ones who were really willing to talk to them were the low performers.
Ah,
Yeah, that's not really how you want it, right? But that dynamic exists, right? So we could see that the low performers were actually the ones listening to and connecting with the newcomers.
but it's not who you want. So how do you help those newcomers break into that higher performance resource?
Exactly. Yes, you need to make sure that you actually build those intentional connections, as you said, right? The other thing I normally say that is really important is that don't have like a massive onboarding program where you take 100 new employees, you put them away for training for 1 week or whatever, because what happens is that when new people come into an organization, that you have a certain space for building connections in your brain, and when you are new to an organization, I mean, the space is open for building it, right? The question is, with whom should you fill it? Do you want to fill it with other newcomers? Well, that doesn't really give you any integration with anyone, right? Or do you want to fill it with the right people, the people you really need to connect to? And that's where the discipline comes into the picture. And most organizations, they have, in my view, the wrong attitude to onboarding. They forget about people relationships and networks.
Well, it's interesting because I was just working with an organization a few weeks ago that was describing their onboarding, and they call them cohorts, the people that came into the
Yeah,
organization at the same time, and they have a bunch of social activities for those folks to go do stuff together and to really integrate them together. But they may be better off if they made sure that some of those influencers or that 3% or those mentors were part of that those groups as well.
yeah. They need to get exposed to the doers, etc. Right? It's a word of mouth. Who should I get in contact with if I want to get this done? Right? It's normally not within your team, but that word of mouth you need to connect them to.
Very, very interesting. So okay, we've identified that 3% now, and let's say we've incorporated them into it. We've got them on board.
Yeah,
They've given their feedback and are bought in.
yeah.
Um, then how did they influence, the self-interest, I guess, and the view of each of those other individuals? How do we make sure it gets down to that granular level, without compromising, I guess, the trust that people have in those influencers.
Exactly. And you don't want to give them a yellow T-shirt where it says "I'm an influencer." That's probably the worst thing you can do, right? And that's where I'm saying you need to convince them to co-create with you or collaborate with you, right? So they define what are the activities that actually make sense in this context. If they want to take ownership then over some of those activities, then you're in the winning position. That's the best place you can be, actually.
Well, then they take that back to their groups, and is it are they the ones then that introduce the idea of the change, or are they just available when the change is announced, as resources
No,
for
you still
the
have to do the top-down communication or the top communication,
mm-hmm.
right? But they are then the ones that people will seek out and ask, so what is this new thing that the top executives are launching here, right? And that's where they are the sense makers. They are actually the ones that will tell them if this is actually okay. This is good for the company.
I like that term, the sense makers. Yeah. Okay. So they can make it make sense to
I normally say
everybody.
they remove the resistance, right? That's what they do.
Perfect. Okay, and they just do that naturally
Yeah.
because if they bought in and they're trusted, then they probably earned that trust,
Yeah.
and so they get the big picture.
Yeah.
From a employment laws being what they are, different in every state and different in every country. But would you say that once you've identified that those 3% who are, I'm sure you can have the 3% who are negative too. I mean, some of some of those people can have a negative influence as well. Yeah. But if you have identified the ones who are positive, who are really contributing and they're trusted, maybe they're not your top performers as far as whatever the actual role is, but they are, they're the glue in those work groups. You identify them. How do you treat them? When you're looking at compensation and all the retention issues, does their retention become a bigger priority for the organization than it might have been otherwise?
I think one of the things that happens is that I mean, the first thing you do is actually you tell them. That's at least what we recommend as an open approach here. You actually tell them, well, your peers have identified you as a person that matters. That is a praise that really is good to have, right? Just imagine you suddenly you hear that everybody's actually pointing to you. I mean, that will retain a lot of people from moving around, I can tell you. We typically don't recommend that you give them a different role or that you give them a raise or whatever, because that changes the us and them dilemma. Exactly. I mean, if you put them into a group now, separate from where they actually have their informal influence, right? Mm-hmm. Then they're gone. Their influence evaporates. So you want to keep them in the normal work setting, and that also means the way you engage with them has to be somehow informal in the way it is done, right?
So that's really interesting, and I can see where a leader who's trying to turn all the knobs and levers to, for lack of a better term, manipulate or influence things would almost even try to curry favor with these influencers rather than just build a more organic trust and really include their buy-in. So because these guys, the ones that you want, are clearly not the ones who are just sycophants or they're brown nosing the boss all day, because those people don't have trust with their peers. And so so you've got to keep them plugged into the organization, but at the same time, maybe they're the first to know. They're the ones who get input into, who get to represent their peers informally.
Or you ask them for advice on how should we do this, right? How should we massage this into the organization? I actually have a good example from close to your region, not a bit south, I think, of where you're based. It's a logistics company, 20 locations. The president now knows his 3%, right? Every single time he visits one of those locations, what's the first thing he does? He doesn't talk to the leaders. He actually talks to the influencers, those 3%, right? try to understand, so what is going on here, right? What's on your mind? What are the questions that I should ask, etc., right? And then he has the meetings with the leaders, which is all good. And then he ends with a town hall meeting. And just to make sure that he actually gets questions that are also, I mean, a bit tough from the audience, he has actually he always decides to answer the tough questions from the influencers first, just so they know he's actually going to respond to whatever we ask him. And that has worked enormously well, right? Because suddenly he has generated this trust, and everybody knows what is going on in the organization, and that is it's a really nice case. He also had this other thing he did, that he took them out for brown bag lunches, right? Do you call them? I think you call them
Yeah,
brown bag
yeah,
lunches. Yeah. So
sure.
out for a brown bag lunch, right? Because you immediately, when you do that, you remove that formal barrier, right? I'm the boss, you're my employee, right? You kind of level people out.
Right. So you're just sitting with them and just having lunch, and just, it's not across a desk or, from a podium. It's just, breaking bread with somebody to have a conversation.
Yeah, I think that's important. So the good leaders know that, right? They need to level out that thing.
So we're up against time, but is there any last thought, do you think, last thing that you think a leader really ought to understand about these informal networks and how they affect change?
Oh, there's so many things, right? One of the things we didn't touch upon, and I know you and I talked about it, is in our data we've seen that there are actually 6 things that actually block companies from succeeding with change. We call them the 6 change blockers. And if I just go through them really quickly, so one of the things, the first one is the unity of the leadership team. Is it acting as one? In most cases, it's not.
Right.
And we all know it, right? If the employees see that the leadership team is not acting as one and supporting the change, well, you will not succeed. So that's number
Right.
one.
And sometimes you just have to say, we're going to do this as an organization. And if this leader is not going to get on, it's time for him to get off the bus. And, and it's not if you don't believe in this, it's not a failure on your part. That's a hard conversation to have, but this is where we're going. And rather than drag you along and put you in a situation where you're uncomfortable or don't believe in what we're doing, well, it's time for you to exit. And that's a hard conversation to have.
but you have to.
Sure.
So that's number one. Number two, where all the companies are also failing, or not failing, but a lot of are, is the fragmentation of the network. So the more silos you have, I mean, the more you're not working together, right? The less ripple effects you will have when you try to convince people.
And these influencers don't even have to be in the same work group, I guess. I'm reminded when I was in healthcare 30 years ago, one of the people I connected to early in my career was actually in accounting.
Yeah.
And we would have had I don't even remember how we connected initially, but we would have had very little interaction, except that somehow we connected and we clicked. And he had a lot more experience in the organization, and he was who especially early in that part of that engagement with that organization, that I could go to and say, what am I missing here, or what's going on? What's driving this?
Yeah. So that part, right? So the fragmentation, the more fragmentation, the more effort you need to put into your change. So that's number two. Number three is there are 2 groups of people that are really, really important. It's the top leaders. Like we talked about before, do they support what you're trying to achieve? They have to across the board. And then you got the 3%. This 3%, the opinion of this 3% is almost magnetic, right? If they are negative, they're going to drag everybody else with them in the downward direction. Whereas if they're positive, it's almost like an early warning signal, right? If they're positive, they will convince the others. So that's number 3. Number 4 is a basic thing: is commitment. Do I like the company I work for? If people do not like the company you're working for, well, you're going to have a hard time succeeding with any change, right? Because why would they ever invest in this change, right? So that's number 4. Then we've got 2 left. The 2 left are more on the implementation side, and it has to do with the leadership, the ongoing leadership support and attention, I would call it, to the change. Are they staying on top, or are they just launching it and then going back to their corner office and then they check in again 1 year later, because that's not good behavior. You actually need to stay on top over time. Make sure that you add the resources needed and so forth, right? And you keep track of what is going on. That's number 5. Number 6 is a basic one again. I think it's the project team. Is the project team set up for success? Do they have enough resources and so forth? What we often see is that companies, when they hire us, I mean not only us, but they come to the analytics part, right? Now we have the analysis, and they have no thoughts about, okay, what are we doing when we actually have to get this massaged into the organization? And it really no, I don't understand it. It's about 80% of companies that forget about this last part.
What do they do instead then? I mean, if I guess I'm maybe I'm just naive, but are they just giving people marching orders and then we'll see you next year,
Yeah, so this is where they suddenly put something on people's plate on top of whatever people are doing already, right? And then you got a full-time position, and suddenly you also have to do this change job, right? And so that's where it goes. Yeah.
So yeah, this is a priority in addition to all the other priorities you've got, and so we're not going to re-level. And I think that happens. A lot of organizations that don't have real strategic planning sessions and don't have the accountability upward that a manager can't challenge a director, or a director can't challenge an executive. Okay, you've said this is what our priorities are this year. Now you're adding this. Does that mean these aren't priorities? Or, there's only so many hours in a day. We've only got so many resources to allocate. And you've got to challenge that back and tie it back to the, whatever the strategic plan is. And it can't just be the flavor of the week, because I think that kills credibility too, right? If the leadership just shows up every week when we get a new idea,
exactly.
that kills credibility and creates, and probably those influencers will be telling people, yeah, don't really worry about it because it'll be different next week.
Coming next week. Exactly. Yeah, that's worse.
Well, we need to I want to have you back just to dig deeper into all 6 of those issues, because I think we've touched on that 3% idea and those informal networks, but I really want to dive into the rest of those. But for now, thank you for joining me, Jeppe.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you, Mike.
And I want to thank my friend, Dr. Maria Gavrilova Aguilar, for introducing us. She's the senior lecturer at the G. Brent Ryan College of Business at the University of North Texas. And so I got to give her a shout out because she is one of the people that I will get a comment from as soon as the podcast drops on Thursday. She's always good to give me feedback and usually point out where I was wrong. But anyway, so thank you, Maria. Yeah, and thank you again, Jeppe.
Thank you. It was great talking to you.
And thank you for listening. You can comment on this episode or search our previous episodes at goodmorninghr.com or on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube. And don't forget to follow us wherever you get your podcast. Rob Upchurch is our technical producer, and you can reach him at robmakespods.com. And thank you to Imperative's marketing coordinator, Marianne Hernandez, who keeps the trains running on time. And I'm Mike Coffey. As always, don't hesitate to reach out if I can be of service to you personally or professionally. I'll see you next week, and until then, be well, do good, keep your chin up.